Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Angular Plus Show. Today, I want to change things a little bit because usually we start with the host, but today I'm extremely excited for my favorite. Actually, I should probably not say that because I
You
very
can say
likely get
favorite
in trouble.
Canadian, maybe. Do we have
Well,
any
no, I mean like it's true, so I can get into trouble for that. For my favorite
favorite guest
former
from
host,
Daybell's province?
say
There
what?
you go. I'm back.
You're back,
I'm back.
Jay. How's it going?
Oh man, it's great. It's so good to be back. I miss hanging out with you guys every week and talking about stuff, but now I get to be the one back that's allowed to talk a lot.
Right, we don't have to be like, Jay, can you let the guests talk a little bit?
Right, right.
You caught me.
No, that never happened. We never talk over our guests. That'd be rude.
It would be absolutely. Yep. Definitely didn't do that ever.
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
Today, I think, if I remember correctly, we are going to talk about GraphQL and more specifically about Apollo GraphQL. Is that correct?
That was the idea.
That was the idea. So
Well,
let's
that's
maybe start with that thing because that still is the thing that bothers me the most about GraphQL. Jay, why do we have, I mean, fundamentally, I get the idea that GraphQL, we have a fancy specification and all that stuff. But then we have all those 500,000 implementations like Apollo GraphQL that are like somewhat in line with the specification, somewhat not, some add features, some not. And you're like sitting there and kind of feel like you're reading a Java specification, not knowing a single thing about Java, and you're still like, yeah, I don't get this thing. So why is this shit so complicated?
That's a great question. I don't really have
The
an
crux
answer
of
for
the issue.
you because we didn't like, so you know how like in every technology, there's usually like the one that everyone knows, right?
Mhm.
Like call it like the Apple of that technology, right? Like
Mhm.
OpenAI is like the AI company.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Careful.
It's like the Band-Aid of plaster bandages, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? There's like the main brand one, even though like they're not the only one and they're not the only right decision, but they are like the one that everyone kind of, they're the one, the first one that comes up on Google,
Right.
Yes.
right? Like that kind of thing, right? That seems to be Apollo from as
Mhm.
far as I can tell.
Yeah.
That
It
explains
just
a lot.
worked. I didn't have to read or understand the specification, right? Like it just kind of did exactly what it promised. Like, yeah, of course there's complexity, and I know one of people's biggest gripes with GraphQL, just kind of overall, not just an Apollo thing, is like the boilerplate and the, you know, all that kind of stuff. But I like, yes, there's a lot of boilerplate. I'm not going to refute that. That being said, a lot of that can be resolved by good engineering practices and code generation practices and tooling practices. So it's not a problem in my mind, especially when you're building really large APIs, complex APIs that pull data from potentially dozens of sources. Like it's hard to abstract wildly complex things to something that is stupidly simple, but people seem to think that's possible. I don't know.
Let's maybe take like 30 steps back because I've used Apollo or GraphQL and Apollo GraphQL once, so I have like a rough idea of what you're talking about. Like, let's assume, just for the sake of our listeners, I have no idea what Apollo GraphQL or GraphQL in general is.
Great. Okay.
So that should be pretty easy for you because usually that's the default state for me when we talk.
Totally.
So, what is GraphQL?
Okay. So let's take a look at the two kind of the main, I would say, quote unquote, the main ways to build an API, either REST and GraphQL, right? Those are probably the top two.
What about SOAP?
Obviously,
What
so
about
everyone's doing
TRPC?
that.
What
Way
about
before my time,
proto
guys.
buffer? I don't know.
Way before my time. I've never used SOAP. I never planned to use SOAP. I refused.
One time was given a SOAP WSDL that we were meant to integrate with, and then we went back through our code and realized we didn't actually need it. We could just do a SQL request against the table.
Classic. Yep.
So that's how I used SOAP. Anyways.
So REST and GraphQL, they're kind of like the main two. If we take a look at them, like let's just take a step back to a technology that most, if not all of the listeners here will understand, which is SQL, SQL, like querying a database, right? You write a select statement to select, star from customer where last name equals Bell, right?
Mhm.
REST is akin to selecting from a single table, where GraphQL is akin to selecting from multiple tables via a single command, right? So you can say REST would be, select star from customer where last name equals Bell, right? Whereas GraphQL, you could do select star from customer where last name equals Bell. This is going to be incorrect SQL, so don't write this, but join on orders, join on, I don't know, credit cards, and then that would give you back an object of, my customer record with an orders property that's an array of orders and a payment methods property that's an array of payment methods, right? So it's one call that gets you kind of a tree of data versus REST, which is generally speaking, I know some, there are different implementations. Like I know with the Stripe API, for example, you can quote unquote expand certain properties, and it kind of is something similar. But generally speaking, REST is like, here's the endpoint to get the customer. Here's the endpoint to list the orders. Here's the endpoint to do that, right? With
And they always give you
GraphQL,
like a set response, right?
exactly.
Like, it's like you're always going to get these 10 properties. They'll satisfy the contract, so it's either defined or not defined or whatever, but you can't pick and choose off that.
Whereas with GraphQL, you're kind of writing a query akin to a select statement with joins that would give you back the data that request is requesting. So you can, as long as your GraphQL is set up correctly, you can query anything in the tree that's linked via the relationship. So every request could be different. Maybe you want the orders one time, and maybe you don't want the orders another time. That's just a different GraphQL query, but it's all the same endpoint. Everything's structured the same way, and it's just the requester is choosing what data they want as part of that single request.
Yeah, and it's all the same endpoint as long as you have it set up for your endpoints. Like if you have like 35 REST endpoints and you make a GraphQL endpoint on each of those REST endpoints, if you don't, you have to either federate them together, or you have to make, I can't remember what they call it. It's like an orchestrator GraphQL endpoint that knows how to call all the REST endpoints to get all the stuff.
Yeah, so like with one of the big benefits of GraphQL is like the consumer, the client, doesn't actually know or care where the data is coming from, and GraphQL allows you to kind of merge and pull data from all these different data sources. So one resolver, which is sort of like an endpoint within the endpoint, one resolver could pull from the Stripe API, another one could pull from the database, another one could pull from a Redis cache, another one could pull from whatever. But all the client knows is it's getting its tree of requested data, right? So you can easily pull from all these different sources. So each resolver can have a completely different implementation. You can pull from Mongo in one and Postgres in another, and like it doesn't matter as long as all the data gets pushed, like merged together into that tree and returned to the client, right?
Yeah.
So usually there's only one GraphQL endpoint you would hit though, and you would have different root nodes. So you start at like with Trellis, for example, there's one root node for the organization, and under that there's fundraisers, and then under fundraisers there's event tickets, and et cetera, right? So you always start at a root node.
So the thing that I think is funny is the first argument that people bring up, well, you can query like your fields and stuff, but how often does this actually happen? Because like developers, I hate to say it, but think very resource oriented and very object oriented. So like you said, like, okay, I want a fundraiser or whatever that is, but so how often does it happen that you fetch that several times in like various granularity in like the context of one business application? I understand the appeal for GraphQL when you're like a general purpose API where like you provide an API and like Stripe or whatever, and like different consumers consume that. Like totally makes sense for that use case, but like for the normal business applications that I've seen in 10 years of consulting, it's usually more or less, there are exceptions, but more or less one backend, one consumer. And even though people might now be like, well, but what about microfront? It's still same thing. Several servers, one consumers.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's obviously not the right tool for every job. Even within a single application, you shouldn't use GraphQL for everything. Like our authentication endpoints are still REST. We do not do authentication through GraphQL. I mean, obviously you pass authentication headers to your GraphQL request, but you're not like doing user authentication through GraphQL mutations
Right.
and resolvers, right? So there's that within there. But then even then, like, sure, GraphQL is probably overkill for some applications where, you know, maybe there's only one client, like you said, right? One consumer. Maybe they're relatively simple, even if they're complex, but like the data is very, you're viewing very defined slices and verticals of data in your application, right? Like the reason we like GraphQL at Trellis so much is our pages are crazy dynamic, right? A lot of it is user generated. We're linking so many different things because we've built a product that kind of amalgamates like 4 or 5 different like verticals of competitors into a single product, right? And you need to be able to link all those different things together that they don't have to link. So GraphQL gives us this like really, really flexible ability to build out these UIs and dynamic things and link all the data together that isn't traditionally linked together, because then the consumer doesn't need to worry about querying this data from this endpoint and that data from that endpoint and then merging it on the front end to be able to show it, right? The endpoint just has it all there for us, right? The other reason why we like it so much, and it might be a good option for some other people, is we move so quickly as an engineering team at Trellis that a lot of the times, like our product designer, Robin, will be like, hey, I want to add this thing to the front end. How long do you guys think that'll take? We're like, oh, it actually just already exists because you can query for that thing through this relationship, right? Like, yeah, you can do that with REST as well, but now you're hitting another endpoint. That's another API call. You have to do more data merging. With us, it's just like, okay, just go add the property to that quote unquote SQL query, the GraphQL query, and now your front end has access to it, right? It's like a couple lines change, right? So the ability to build out these like very heavily relational server queries effectively, right, allows us to move really, really quickly because all of our data is so inherently linked together. It's just like one graph to manage, and then the clients can just do whatever they want. They can always just query whatever they want. It's not a burden. Like in terms of the Angular space, you know, one of our feature components will have a single component store. That component store does all of the querying, and all of the querying is only one query. There isn't all these multiple queries to pull this data to display it in the way that the consumer wants, right? So, but it's not the right decision for everybody. As with everything in technology and programming, right? Like you need to consider if this is the right option for you. The overhead's okay. Do you have the time to dedicate to building up good tooling? Because otherwise it's going to be a burden, right? So
have you done stuff with Gatsby, just out of curiosity?
never. No, I've never used Gatsby.
Okay. So Gatsby used like their whole architecture was like based around GraphQL. So I was wondering if you're like, if that led to their downfall or if it was the founder's fault. Different essentially.
We used GraphQL heavily on a mobile application because I was doing work for a grocery store, and the way their database was structured, each product, like there were like 50 properties that might show up on the product. So like the REST endpoint, the response would be huge. And we usually needed the title and the price and maybe the picture URL. Like we didn't need to know like what aisle it was on or like all this other random stuff that wasn't even really populated anymore, but would still come back in the response because it was empty, you know, like.
Yeah, that's another great thing to point out is that like, so let's say you have that customer object, right? That we're saying, Jay. So like in a REST one, you would have the customer object and it returns all the properties. Maybe some of those properties are computed, right? Whether they're cached in a Redis or they're computed on the fly when you make the request, whatever, right? But they're computed properties. With GraphQL, those properties could actually just be a separate resolver so that you've isolated out the computedness of it to a resolver. And then the consumer can pick and choose what to query. They're not just picking and choosing what relations to query. They're actually picking and choosing what properties to query. So you can, some of your queries actually end up quicker than a REST query because you're like, oh no, I only want these 3 static properties. And it won't even trigger those computed ones. Now, again, you of course can do this in REST, right? But it's not like a first class supported. Like you have to pass in a query param for what properties you want to query, and then you need to do some work on the back end, but that's the work that GraphQL does for you. So that the GraphQL knows like, oh, I'm just not even going to execute that computed resolver, right?
Yeah,
But that adds more
no.
overhead to building your resolvers correctly. So you don't do like, again, more overhead, but it is more powerful, right? You have to like, don't do your computed in the single resolver for your object. Like if you have one resolver for a customer and you're doing your computed stuff in there, that's not going to save you from doing computed if you only select the 3 static properties. You gotta architect it correctly. And that's why it's an engineering problem. It's not a technology problem.
Right. It's like GraphQL is not a thing where you can slap it into your app and be like, haha, now it's faster.
Oh God, no,
That
not
bit
even
might be
remotely.
slower.
Yeah, not even. You have to design and architect it well, and we've done a ton of work on that at Trellis to make it easy to do these things. But you gotta do it. You gotta think about what it means when building your resolvers and what properties you're putting in your core resolver versus your computed resolvers, so that the clients aren't making these requests that are constantly computing things or pulling from caches or whatever, but then not actually returning that data because the consumer doesn't actually want it, right? So typically the pattern we follow is the core resolver for whatever entity returns the static properties from the database table.
That can just fetch.
It's a single read. You don't really save anything by only select certain columns from a database column, right? Like that performance difference doesn't matter that much. Now, of course, big asterisks, everything depends on technology, so don't at me. But you know what I mean, right?
Jay Bell said,
Jay Bell said, don't optimize your SQL.
CTO at Trellis. Jay Bell.
So the core resolver returns the entity from the database table.
Yep.
Anything beyond that is computed resolvers.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Yeah. That makes sense.
That's the general pattern that we follow, because then the consumer can be sure that by not selecting those, they're not affecting the performance of the server.
Right. Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So one thing that bothers me with GraphQL is that that query is a very fancy string with like a little bit of its own DSL.
Oh God, yeah, that's like one of the biggest gripes of GraphQL for sure. It's like it's only one post endpoint, and you send the query as a stringified version of their DSL in the post body operation property or whatever property it is.
And then like it always returns 200, right? Even if it errors, like
so it always returns 200. So you have to make sure you're parsing the body for a success versus failure. So like we've built utilities for this. It's not a problem for us. We have custom ArcsJS, pipe operators. So it's like tap query response or tap mutation response. We're not using just tap response, right? So then those would parse the body and then either, next and complete or error, the observable, so that the user, i.e. the developer writing the code for the Angular application, can use tap response like they normally would, right? There's a next callback, there's a complete callback, and or finalize, whatever. There's the 3, and then error callback, right? So we built all these utilities so they don't need to worry about that quirk, right?
Yeah.
We've quirked it into a normal pattern. We've turned the quirk into a normal pattern.
Right.
But yes, again,
embrace the
that's
quirk.
one of the big gripes with GraphQL. It's like, oh, it doesn't follow the standard where errors. I'm like,
just learn
technically, yes.
Yeah.
But the benefits that we're getting far outweigh some, sense of virtue that I have about not following the standards. Like, sure. I'm for whatever's going to help us deliver our product the quickest to the highest quality. Full stop. Yep. That's my job as a co-founder and CTO of Trellis.
Yeah.
I need to deliver the product. And if building a GraphQL API helps me do that, which it has, we've drastically improved our engineering speed, quality, since we've implemented it. I don't care.
And so in theory, someone could just make GraphQL requests using HTTP client.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You don't need a special client at all. All it is a post request. You have to format it correctly and stuff like that, right? But yeah,
that sounds horrible.
Yeah, it's awful. That's why you use a library of some sort.
But Jan, you can't.
Yeah,
But
I
you do?
can.
No,
I
but
can also
you
jump out
can't?
of the window right here, but I won't.
Yeah, please,
Right.
please, please do not be making GraphQL requests with a plain HTTP client. Please, for the love of God, go find yourself a GraphQL client to use,
Right.
whether
So
that
like
be Apollo or something else.
on that topic, what do GraphQL clients bring to the table?
That's a great question.
Yeah, so so this is both a strength and I guess some people see it as a drawback is GraphQL has a strong like code gen story, or at least Apollo, or no, it's GraphQL has a code gen story. It's not the code gen works with like the GraphQL code gen works with Apollo,
Yeah.
where you can define your queries. So whether these be mutations, post, put, delete in rest downs, or queries, get queries, or yeah, so those would go to resolvers or mutations, right? So you define that in the GraphQL DSL, and then you would run your code gen. And so, for example, Apollo Angular, it'll generate all the TypeScript types for you for the response types, the enums, the, all of that kind of stuff, the query type, the mutation type, all of that. And then it'll actually generate you services, injectable services that you can call just .query, and you pass in your query properties, right? And then it abstracts away all of that, format the query this way, send the query, post the query this way, stuff like that. And you're now interacting with just an Angular service, right? And you're saying, customer service dot query where last name contains bell insensitive, right? And now you're just working with Angular services. You can use that in your component store, whatever kind of store you're using and stuff like that. So, but you have to stitch together certain things. So again, more overhead. But if you have tooling for it, like we have, like everything's automated at Trellis. Your cogen, like adding a cogen target to an NX library, automated. Even managing the cogen files, automated. Compiling your cogen targets, all linked together through your dependency graph in your NX graph, right? Like I've spent a lot of time, and my team has spent a lot of time building out this tooling so it doesn't get in our way. It's a boon for us, not a detractor, right? But if you're just getting into it, there's a lot to consider, right?
There's a lot to consider.
Right? And it could be overwhelming. And you're like, this seems like a lot of boilerplate to solve my problem. But we've gotten it to the part because I always push for tooling first when we implement a new technology, process, whatever, because I'm not having that kind of stuff interfere with my engineering operations. Full stop.
Yeah, I don't want my mid-level devs to have to ping me and be like, can you please tell me how to use the CodeGen API because I need to generate types and a service for this. Like, yeah, that is we are in the very early stages of adding GraphQL to an application. And so I phoned a friend and his name is Jay Bell. And so which because of course obviously we use an NX monorepo because we have a large application. I say obviously there are people that don't use NX monorepos, but I like what NX
You should be using one now.
Right, exactly. And we're not paid for these comments.
We might be NX champions, but we're not paid.
We're not paid in any way. But there isn't an existing plugin for this that I found.
No, there isn't. So we've built all of our own NX executors, NX generators, all of that. So like when we run like NX compile Thomas is our dashboard application. We name all of our apps after trains here at Trellis. So all of our internal applications are named after
That is
we have
so
like
awesome.
Thomas, Orient, Frontier, Snowpiercer, Hogwarts is our internal magic dashboard.
Snowpiercer, what happens in that one? That's nuts.
So when you run NX compile Thomas, it'll generate the schemas, it'll compile the code gen, it'll compile the service work. Like we linked the whole dependency graph together, and then all those targets are cached or cacheable. So generally speaking, when you run NX compile insert front end app name, those 150 cogen targets are just pulling from cache. Because we have I just looked, it was we have 1,300 NX libraries at Trellis. you know, some portion of those are backend, some portion of those are shared utilities, and then a good portion of them are client-side libraries for our Angular applications, right? And a lot of them have code gen targets. Like, yeah, you could do one massive code gen, but then you don't get the incrementality, right? So again, you have to invest in the tooling so that when a dev serves the application, right? It's not just compile that runs the code gen targets. NX serve Thomas also runs a code gen target so that your serve works correctly, right? Because it's all relying on those compiled TypeScript types, injectable services, enums, query, response, mutation, et cetera, right? So we've linked the whole dependency graph together top to bottom.
Nice.
So that serve, compile, build, all of those would run all of your code gen targets before it actually gets to the target that you called.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay. So a lot of us are used to using some sort of code generator to generate services from REST endpoints. How is the process different using GraphQL? Have you done enough code gen with REST to I guess you've probably done some, but
only like a small amount. I mean, it all kind of depends on the tooling that you're using, right? But like I wouldn't say it's dissimilar, right?
Yeah.
You have to annotate your GraphQL in a certain way, just like you'd have to annotate your REST in a certain way. Or I guess with REST, a lot of times it's a Swagger. It's a Swagger thing, right? But you got to annotate your stuff right so that your Swagger docs get generated, right? Like you have to say this property is a string, and you know, a lot of the cogens can infer some stuff based on like the TS type and you know whatever, right? But like a lot of times you have to say like this is optional, this is nullable, this is a string, this has a custom validator on it, this is a nested object or an array object of these objects, right? You have to, regardless of how you're doing code gen, you need annotations, right? The GraphQL is no different than that. You would just annotate each of your different effectively response types, your DTOs, right? And then there's one additional step though. Well, I guess there's an additional step. You're just swapping the Swagger generation for generating a server GraphQL file, which is kind of just like a compiled GraphQL schema of your application. And then that is what all of your consumer graph code gens point at. So they know how to write, and you get auto completion and stuff like that in your term. JetBrains has a great plugin for, you know, pointing a library at a certain server GraphQL, because you've pointed at the generated GraphQL, you don't point it at the server exactly. I'm sure you can, but we compile ours so that it can be cacheable, and then in the repo and you know offline and stuff like that. So you get all these type annotations. But yeah, it's like you annotate the server, you generate the server GraphQL. That is now a file on disk. All of your client-side cogen files point to that or a different one, right? Like we have 2 different GraphQL servers at Trellis. So certain ones, when we say like NX add GraphQL cogen, insert project name, because we're adding GraphQL to a new library, right? It'll ask like, okay, what schema does this one point to? Because the library should only point to one server, right? It's either the backend server, backend from our users' point of view, or the front end server for their users, right?
Oh, gotcha.
So then they would ask that, right? Like the donors are the charities. It's effectively, it's kind of like there's a donor API and there's a charity API, right?
Yeah, so Trellis has like a slightly, like they have 2 very distinct types of users.
Exactly, right? We sell to charities, and then the charities use our product to collect donations from their donors.
Yeah, so if you were like a grocery store, you would probably just have one GraphQL
more than likely. Yeah, exactly, right? So our code gen, not GraphQL code gen, but our generators actually ask the developer, hey, what server GraphQL do you want to point this code gen at?
Right.
And then it's an interactive prompt in your terminal, blah, blah, blah. And then it would write the code gen files for that consumer onto disk in that NX library's root, right? And now you have your client-side code gen file pointing at your server code gen file that was generated from your GraphQL server annotations.
Right. And so that's the schema definition language. They sometimes call that SDL, right? Where it goes, like, that's where you go in and you're like, for my type customer, it has a property that's name and it's a string. It's not nullable. They have this, it's a number. It's not, I can't remember. It's not number,
exactly.
Like
yeah.
Whatever.
And there's 2 ways to do it. You can either do schema first or code first.
Right.
So if you go schema first, you can generate code from your schema, and then that ends up as your server code. Or if you go code first, you write the code and then generate the schema. We've done code first because we have a relatively complex like permission system. We have all these computed resolvers, right? We're linking all this kind of data. We have like huge control over what the inputs are and like what your filter conditions are, and we have all these utilities built, so it's not a problem. It's not like a ton of overhead for us. It's a very well defined, clean process now because we have so much like dev friendly utilities and shared code and stuff built for it. But like those are the two ways, right? So you either write that GraphQL file yourself and generate your server, or you write your server and generate the GraphQL file.
Yeah,
right?
but regardless, there's generators through CodeGen that exist to do either way. And then the benefits I've read, well, so we're actually starting with schema first because we're still building the APIs, so we have nothing to generate from. And so the benefits I've read of that is that it's that way you can kind of work, if you're a full stack team, you know, you can start to really nail down what your APIs need to do to satisfy the needs of your UI. We're not a full, like we are kind of siloed front end, back end. And so it gives us a common place to start discussions about what we might need.
That's actually a good point to bring up too, right? Like everything that I've been talking about so far has been from the context of Trellis, where everyone on my team, there's 3 devs and me, we're all full stack developers.
Yeah.
All of our APIs, all of our consumers and clients, all of our code gen, all of our NX targets live in a single repository. So that's how we're able to link all these things together in a really easy way with generators and cachable targets and depends on and task graphs and all that kind of stuff, right? So like, and even then we can do full stack tickets ourselves, right? If we're given a ticket of add this property to the GraphQL and then go use that property on the client, one person can do that and you don't need to go cross teams, right? So that's another reason why this works so well for us and we're able to move so quickly is we don't have dependencies on other teams. GraphQL is a great tool for us because we can just go do the whole thing top to bottom. We can do the code gen, we can add the properties, we can write the resolvers, we can write the mutations, we can add the component store, we can build the UI and then ship that ticket across a single person, which a lot of teams can't because you have that front end team and you have that back end team, and the front end needs to request something from the back end for the GraphQL and et cetera, right?
Yeah. For us, so actually I was using SDL. I was asked to gather the API requirements that we thought we needed, which is, it's kind of a different way of working. I prefer to just go from the product requirements, but this way but I chose to write it in GraphQL. First of all, I was being a bit of a turkey, but I realized that like it's actually really easy to write. It's probably the least verbose way to write it. So
but that's the thing that bothers me so much with it. Yes, it's not verbose, but it's also not an extensive API description or anything. It's literally just in and output. It doesn't specify anything, any kind of behavior that might be triggered. Like, does this mutation send out an email?
What do you mean?
Well, like an API is usually more complex. And that's also the big issue that I have with Swagger, for instance. It literally just describes, this is the data in and this is the data out. With GraphQL, it's a little bit more abstract because it's more like, this is all the data that we have. And like what feel like the structure and stuff.
So is your concern that say the mutation definition in your server GraphQL doesn't describe what the mutation's doing fully, like all the side effects?
Well, it completely lacks any documentation on behavior of the API. Full stop.
And does REST do that?
Well, not Swagger. Because Swagger is also stupid. But if you use...
fair. So how does a REST
if you
endpoint do that?
Like, if you do like proper architecture work and like create documentation, that's part of that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's an engineer. That's not a technical engineering problem. That's a process team problem. You can document GraphQL APIs. We document ours super well.
I'm just saying that's an issue that I have with GraphQL and Swagger. I'm not saying that REST is so much better about that. REST is absolutely not better about that because
you still need to rely on devs to do their jobs correctly and document.
Right, but like it's so for instance, if you part of behavior descriptions, for instance, what happens if I call an API request multiple times in a short time? Is that a thing that is allowed? Like, what is the what are rate limits on it? But those information are important for even for front-end developers just to do their job.
Of course. Yeah.
And if you just have like a technical specification, or this is what I put in and this is what I get out, you don't have that information.
Sure.
And still people are just like, well, but I need the Swagger documentation. And you're like, well, but Swagger is stupid.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's always ways to document things. It's just up to the dev if they're spending the time to do it correctly, right? Like, we document our mutations. Like, you can go look at our generated server GraphQL, or even to extend beyond that, the generated types in the client-side code. You can go look at that, and like they'll be annotated with what the mutation's doing.
So no, okay, I have opinions on generated code.
Yes, I'm sure you do.
What?
You have a few opinions, Jan.
How do you feel about the generated code that those code gen tools?
Like the quality of the generated code? Yes. I mean, it's wildly simple. It's like some types, some interfaces, and then like a
well, but you mentioned also services, for instance, for Angular.
Yeah, and so it's a service that has a constructor that extends like an Apollo Angular construct. It's like each service is like 4 lines plus a decorator. That's it. Because all it does is it passes in the GraphQL fragment, like the DSL query, into Apollo Angular. All those services are they're effectively wrapping the internal Apollo Angular construct to provide you type hinting. That's really all they're doing. They don't actually have functional code in them.
Yeah, because you can call you don't need code gen necessarily to work to make Apollo client work.
Yeah. Right. So like the quality of the code is fine because there's like no functional code in it.
Well, but if you say like, okay, this generates like 20 services that are all 4 lines, that sounds like super unnecessary amount of code. And I would like if a dev comes to me and creates like a code like that, I would easily reject that pull request. And just because it's generated, we lower our standards for that. And there are subtle nuances, I do agree, but like the bundle size impact, for instance, is still very much an aspect. Might be different for like B2B business.
I'll concede that for sure. Like, is it more code than if you went to handwrite things? Yes. Is the trade-off in engineering speed and quality we're getting, like overall product quality we're getting, outweighing the fact that there's a bunch of 4-line services?
And that's the thing where I was curious that I wanted to hook into, because you described in the beginning that you developed all those toolings to make it work nicely in your mono repository. So would you still say, I don't know how much time it took you, if that was just like with NX it was like 3 lines of code and within 10 minutes everything worked. Usually tooling is not quite that simple, and it's more like very frustrating. Does it work now? Commits, and it's still not working. So if you consider all that time, like, how do you evaluate at the beginning of a project, okay, this is still worth it? Because you don't know exactly how long it will take you to implement all this tooling.
Totally.
And you cannot really assume the output, because at that point you don't know, oh, it will increase our velocity.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a certain amount of like pray and hope, but you also need to be smart about prototypes and spikes, right? Like everything we do at Trellis, we try and do an initial spike just to see how much work it's going to be. And like, just to give you an idea, our what was I going to say here? All of our tooling is like, I don't know, a couple hundred lines of code.
Okay, that's not
like, it's not thousands of lines of code with all this complex stuff. It's like, for the code gen, it's like, you know, one executor target that calls the code gen CLI, but just populates the project path to the config file. Like, you know, the server GraphQL one, all it does is it spins up our existing API with the configuration set to output the server GraphQL in a certain location. Like, couple hundred lines of code, maybe 300 lines of code total across all of our front end, back end, code gen executors and generators.
That's not too bad. The way you talked about it sounded like, the whole team was waiting on like everything. And it was like this huge moment when like out of nowhere everything worked and like popcorn was flying through the room.
No. I mean, like, it was iterative, obviously.
Yeah.
it was iterative, and we've improved it over time, right? And as we've, as NX has improved too, we've gone back to update things and, stuff like that. Like,
Yeah.
we spent a lot of time improving and optimizing the tooling, but the tooling resulted in something simple because we didn't have to write the code gen logic. We didn't have to, these are just wrappers to make it simple to interact with within our repository, right?
Yeah.
So,
and the code that we use Open API code generation against REST endpoints, Swagger.
Yeah.
The code that we're generating for the GraphQL stuff is dramatically less. Like the REST endpoints, I mean, that was almost always our biggest package, especially depending on how the APIs were architected. Like we had one endpoint that returned it, or one API that had so many endpoints, and the Open API generator wouldn't split those up for us.
Of course.
So it was like, well, if you need anything out of here, you're getting it all.
Totally.
And that was hard. And that was a hurdle we couldn't get over because there was no hunger on the API side to split those up. And so, which was now using GraphQL, I think that we'll be able to have a much smaller footprint of generated code versus like the Open API code that we were generating.
Totally. And you can generate at a smaller incremental level too, right? I mean, like, I'm going to preface this by saying I haven't used that many REST / Open API / Swagger code generation tools, so I don't know exactly what the power is there. I'm assuming it's pretty mature. Correct me if I'm wrong. No, yes, it's mature.
I already shared my opinion that I think they're garbage.
Okay,
Lara's statement kind of proved my point.
We always get a new dev will come in, they review a pull request with generated code, and they are picking apart the services for why they're doing it a certain way.
I would do that too.
Yeah. So like, knowing that, I would say the generation story in GraphQL is better. It's kind of like it's a first class citizen, right? Like GraphQL was built with that in mind, whereas on REST, like, I don't know if it was built with it in mind, but like it's a first class citizen within the ecosystem now, right? Like GraphQL code gen is a thing from GraphQL.
But isn't, I'm confused on that because GraphQL is originally by Facebook, right?
Yes.
And they're not using TypeScript.
Well, I didn't say TypeScript code gen. I said just code gen in general. I'm sure Facebook has some kind of internal, like it was built with code gen things in mind, right? Like GraphQL, I'm sure, as with everything in the web, the technology industry that was created back in the 90s and early 2000s, like I'm sure it was hacked together at the start and the specifications evolved over time and, et cetera, like think about the JavaScript programming language, right?
Okay.
I think GraphQL was designed at a time where we had the benefit, as with everything that comes out a decade or two later, right? The benefit of looking at, what was hacked together the first time around. And I don't know the actual history of GraphQL that much. I actually met the guy that created it one time, but that was before we were using it. But the code gen story
I listened to a podcast with him, but I forgot all of it.
There you go. Great. The code gen story is better.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
It is. It's very well defined. The tooling is really mature for it, right? Like, yes, you're still code genning versus writing yourself. That being said,
it's artisanal code.
Before we started recording today, we were just talking about artisanal code versus AI generated code. So like, the ship
I would rather have
sailed.
AI generate those services than code gen tools.
The ship has sailed on us being hyper vigilant on not having generated code anywhere. That ship has sailed.
We still can have opinions on like the quality of the tool.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we should always be pushing for more quality. I will absolutely concede that point.
Yeah.
But the trade-off in having a bunch of 4-line services for what the benefits we get of it.
Yeah.
It's not even a conversation I need to have in my mind as a CTO company.
Okay, we can also like, if that is the argument, then we could also bring in like things like TRPC or something that have
course.
type safety over the wire built in.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you still have that benefit of, okay, you can selecting the query, like you can selecting the fields and stuff, which for some application is really great benefit. But other than that, I personally don't see quite the appeal to GraphQL anymore. And like modern architectures, if you know your constraints, you can easily build those things. And it's not like GraphQL does not have constraints.
It's tons of constraints. Yeah, all over the place, right? They're just more complex.
Well, and then there's like a ton of different ways. Like you can write really bad GraphQL, just like you can write really bad.
Oh, yeah. You can.
Like there's, you can do data loaders, you can do batching. Like
It
there's.
is way easier to shoot yourself in the foot writing GraphQL than it is REST.
Yeah. Well, and I think
easier.
like even something like Apollo Client, I worked on a team where we had Apollo Client, but nobody read the documentation that told you that if you don't use the Apollo ID key, which is ID, I think they also accept like whatever, like asset, like if your type is asset, it's that they would accept asset ID as well. But if it's anything else, you have to tell it what it is, or else you don't get any caching, which was the entire point of using Apollo Client.
And that's what I was getting at, right? Like there's a crazy amount of overhead.
Yeah.
In comparison to a REST API.
Yeah.
Quick question on that, because Apollo does come with the data layer for the client-side state management too.
Yeah.
Is that something you're using?
Oh yeah, it's built in. As long as you're defining your primary keys, like Laura
You can
said.
mess it up.
But
Ask me how.
But you did mention also that you're using Signal. So how does that story look like?
Yeah, so
component store.
Component store. Yeah, we're using component store still. We love component store. We have utilities for it, but that's a whole different. I don't have a business benefit to rewriting to Signal Store right now, and we have all these component store utilities that make working with GraphQL easier. So what the component stores are there for is they're kind of like the middleman between the feature components and the Apollo services that get generated. So the component store is what's responsible for pulling the ID from the URL, building out a query observable that gets passed into the watch query for Apollo, and then maybe transforming that data that comes back into selectors so you can select specific things and stuff like that, right? We also have generic component stores that you like abstract ones that you can extend from that will handle pagination for you. That'll handle loading and watching, loading flags, error flags, all of that is abstracted. So if you go to build a new UI that displays a table of this entity, all you do is extend our GraphQL page list component store and then implement a couple of methods like what's the query look like, where are you pulling the IDs from, what does the response transformation look like. It's all strictly typed and all that kind of stuff. So that it's the middleman between, so we're not using Apollo directly in our components. Allows better easier testing, easier mocking, easier combinations and pulling of what your query looks like. Like maybe this ID comes from here, but this other one gets set from the feature component or something like that, right? So they're all just, again, another layer to make it really easy for our devs to work with our GraphQL API.
Yeah, so like for your devs, their daily workflow would be then defining whatever queries or mutations they need for their feature, code genning the services that know how to make those requests.
GraphQL fragment and query and stuff like that,
Yeah, and then interacting with the component stores. So really all your devs need to know about GraphQL is how to write the queries that they need, and the queries are not the same as SDL. Like SDL is where you're defining out types. Queries are literally like, I want a customer and I want its name and its description, and that's all I care about. Just send me that.
The SDL is your database definition, and your queries are your select statements.
Yes. And so your devs really can get away with, if you using Apollo Client, using the tooling that you have set up with CodeGen, doing the optimization you've done on the platform. If you had, like, say, just an intern coming in to write some front-end code, they could just write they'd
It
need
would
to
be
know
really
how to
easy.
write. Yeah, they'd know how to write queries and mutations, and they'd need to probably know that they have to run the generator if they change it. And probably they won't even have to, because how often, once you get your features set up,
Yeah.
like I
And
very
those generators will
rarely.
run automatically when you run serve anyway.
Oh yeah, that's
Right?
nice.
'Cause it's in our task graph. So as soon as you run,
Nice.
as soon as you change that and run serve, that
Yes.
generator is gonna see, oh, I'm different now because
Somebody
the
changed my
files that
query.
define your GraphQL are part of the input cache. Right? So it'd be like, oh,
Yeah.
I have to rerun this target, rerun it. Okay,
Okay.
now I can serve my application. So
Nice.
the only piece of GraphQL that a new developer needs to know if they're coming in to write, say, a front-end feature is
Mhm.
how to write a GraphQL query or a
Yeah.
mutation. The
And that
rest
is,
of it is just Angular.
yeah, and that is because of the tooling that you set up,
Correct.
and that you have people that set up. I feel like it's like anything with any technology we pull in, there's always going to be a team that has to go in and set up, like, how, how are we handling feature flags? How are we handling authentication? And then the daily IC is only going to be touching just barely any of that.
Interacting with the systems that get built for them by
Yeah,
other people,
yeah.
right? Like there's like the two different levels of development inside of a company or more, but like we'll just talk about the two, right? It's like the people that build the systems that
Mhm.
all the other devs use, right?
Yeah.
Authentication, code gen, like a lot of it's tooling, right?
Mhm.
Or it's these core shared systems. Authentication is a great one, right? Like we have decorators use in our Nest app. That turns on authentication,
Yeah.
right? But there's this whole system behind it that no
Yeah.
one needs to really know about. Everyone does at my company because we're small and everyone
Yeah.
has worked and solved bugs and fixed it and stuff like
And
that.
I think that's actually like a better, like, it really, really sucks when the one person who knows how the
Mhm.
thing works either goes on vacation or doesn't work there anymore for whatever reason. So,
Yeah.
yeah, the more you can spread that, but you can effectively isolate some of your team from having to take on that responsibility. So, okay, so Palo Client, we kind of started talking about what it brings to the table, but then we talked a lot about CodeGen. So let's talk a little bit about Apollo Client. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So Apollo Client brings all of the great things that Apollo does for you by, automatically caching, querying, formatting the queries, watch mutations, all that kind of stuff, but layers an Angular API on top of it, right? So you get, I don't actually know if observables are anything that Apollo provides itself, but like there's a full observable story in
Yeah.
Apollo Client because it's turned all of these operations into watch queries that have value changes and all that kind of stuff, right? So really what you're getting is an Angular API layered on top of Apollo.
Yeah. And so like we were actually looking at Urkel, like URQL, I think that's how you say it. You can use that with Angular, but it has its own observable type. So that's a little bit confusing.
Yeah, that's annoying.
It doesn't have a generator. CodeGen doesn't support like Angular service generation. So you get like half of you get the types and stuff because those are not specific to Apollo. They're using different CodeGen plugins, but yeah, it won't generate Angular services for you. Like you can integrate. So Angular Apollo is the only the only GraphQL client that we found when we were doing our research in the last 6 months that fully supports Angular specifically.
I think it's kind of the go-to, is my understanding, for Angular devs to work with Apollo.
Yeah, I mean, because I did a quick poll of the GDEs, and I don't think it's also like there aren't a lot of. I guess I'd be interested to know how many teams are actually using GraphQL versus using REST. I think it's more REST than GraphQL.
GraphQL definitely saw like a steady decline over the last years. There were several startups that tried to provide like the infrastructure aspects of like the whole GraphQL stories, and all of them failed or got acquired by bigger companies. All of them, I know obviously don't know all of them, but all the ones that I knew of, that's how they ended eventually. So,
I think
and
it does.
honestly, I get it. Like, there's a lot of overhead and a lot of complexity with GraphQL, right? Like I'm sure a ton of people were told, oh, GraphQL will solve all your problems. And then they went and used it and they like
That's like
screwed
Gatsby.
their entire
It
company
gave
or
me math
engineering
problems.
process, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
no, like it will solve a lot of problems if you invest the time into it and accept the
Yeah.
constraints that you're getting with it, that
I'll-
it's solving for you compared to REST, right? But there's constraints in anything you do. There's trade-offs in everything you do. There is no silver bullet.
Yeah.
I like to look at it kind of like Rails, where it has like a very stable community of people, and it does solve actual real world problems.
Absolutely.
But you need to have those problems for it to be a viable solution.
Yes.
Exactly. Yes.
Absolutely.
As with everything, don't over-engineer at the start. We started as REST. We
Yeah.
still have lots of REST,
Yeah.
right? But we're moving towards GraphQL because a lot of this stuff on the customers facing, the donors side of the product, a lot of that is built out by the charity, right? It's dynamic UI. Every fundraiser page is different.
Yeah.
All the structure different, all the components are different, the data is
Yeah.
different, everything's different, right? So now there's a unified API that allows us to query each of the different things, but with a single API, and you don't need to make all these different requests, right?
Yeah,
It's just the organization defines what their fundraiser page looks like.
Yep.
And then the client just knows how to query the right data for that case. It selects these things for this case and these things.
That is our exact use case at Cisco, because if you think about Cisco, it's a giant company that has acquired so many other small companies, and our biggest hurdle is data, getting data and normalizing it. So GraphQL gives us a way to pull data from different sources and streamline it through. You can do that with REST, but we have not traditionally done that well with REST. So
yeah, and to be clear, all these problems I'm saying GraphQL has solved for us can be solved with REST. Again, I am not saying this is a silver bullet. I'm talking to our listeners right now. GraphQL isn't just going to solve all those problems that I've talked about. You can absolutely do that with REST. We just chose to do it with GraphQL because we liked working with it. And we are finding that it is wildly beneficial to our engineering process and product development lifecycle.
Okay, so what are some of the optimizations you can do with GraphQL that have really sped up performance in your applications?
Yeah, so one of the big things is being able to pull from the, like having those computed fields and stuff like that, and being able to pull from different data sources. Again, you can do this with REST, but then you're always computing those fields unless you put in your own property selection mechanism of some sort, right? But we've built out this really strong caching system that'll cache entire entities that can be used throughout the entire product, not just for computed fields, but also like, so I know Laura mentioned data loaders just kind of offhand, I don't know, like 10 minutes ago kind of thing. So a data loader is effectively an in-memory store for that request. And the reason that they exist in GraphQL is because as you're querying down, I'm using my hands to display things, but no one can see that.
He's waving them around. He's starting at the top and he's going down.
Starting at the top when you're querying your root node, and then you're getting the next node, you're getting the next one, getting the next node, right? Like those are different function calls in JavaScript effectively, right? Like it's not like a REST call where you have like, it enters your function and then that function does everything and then returns the data. And then that is literally the response from your HTTP server, right? With GraphQL, it comes in and then kind of figures out what resolvers it needs to process, builds a query plan effectively of what order they should be processed in. You know, child resolvers are processed after parent resolvers, but sibling resolvers get processed in parallel, et cetera, right? So because of this, like, so for example, in Charles, the root node, one of the root nodes is organization, and below that is fundraiser, and below that is, you know, event tickets. If you need the fundraiser from the root node that was resolved at the root node in your fundraiser node, that's a different function call, right? So it doesn't necessarily, it's not getting the response necessarily. Like there are parents and, you know, et cetera, but one of the things with data loaders is they're shared across the whole request. So you can prime a data loader in one resolver, and then that data is available without needing to read it from the database again in your child resolvers, right? So you can like kind of build this, okay, here's the data that we've queried so far. So what we've done is there's like multiple layers of caching and optimizations where our resolvers are using data loaders. Those data loaders look at a Redis cache first. If it doesn't exist in the Redis cache, then it goes to a read replica, right? But we built it such that the dev just imports the data loader.
Yeah.
Everything else is handled for them, right? So now like we're working on load tests to actually see. I'll report them on like my Bluesky and stuff like that when we're done with it. But we're building out these massive load tests to run with the model cache completely disabled, and then run with the model cache completely enabled. So you can see the benefit of implementing this caching mechanism with the data loaders.
Yeah.
Data
there's
loaders are also
they batch, right?
So they batch. You can batch request keys. They're shared across the request. So if you batch your GraphQL queries on the client as well, and say like, oh, the client Apollo has made these 3 requests within 100 millisecond time frame, it'll send those as a single request to your GraphQL server and then process them top down, right? Data loads are also shared there because you should be architecting things such that the entity for an ID is the same entity across requests, right? So you can share that data. So data loaders are beneficial in a lot of cases and required, absolutely required for system performance in other cases.
Yeah,
Like,
we had with the grocery store, we needed to match coupons to products. And so as you scroll, we would send individual requests like, now get me the coupons for this, now for this, now for this. And when we put the data loader in there, it was able to batch those requests instead of making individual requests.
Exactly.
Batch together, like however it works off JavaScript ticks. So however many requests came in during that tick.
Yeah.
And if it had seen that request before, it was already in the cache, so it could just hand it back right away. And it did improve.
So there's that on the client side, but then on the server side as well, say you have a GraphQL endpoint that lists products, right? Once that resolver completes and you have a list of say 10 products, each of those products is going to be a GraphQL object, a GraphQL product object, right? That GraphQL product object may have resolvers attached to it that you can then query off of using your query language, right? But if that resolver that's attached to object isn't using a data loader and you need the object in that data loader for some reason, or you need something from higher up in the tree, now you're making that query once per resolver per product. But with data loaders, the data is already going to be in the server side data loader cache. So you just load it from the data loader once. So you're not running that resolver 10 times and making 10 more database queries. So when you're doing lists and pagination and stuff like that, data loaders are absolutely 100% required for server performance. They're not technically required.
They're not technically required.
They're not technically.
Eventually,
you can
someone's
make
going to
database
notice
calls.
how slow your stuff is.
Exactly.
Complain about it. And
if you want, you can make database calls in every resolver. You shouldn't, but you can, right?
What if
so
I
again,
really
that's
want
just
to?
another case of the overhead and complexity that GraphQL sort of inherently imposes on you because of the architecture of it. But if you can figure out how to reduce that via tooling and automation, the benefits are huge.
Yeah.
So just being able to like incrementally separate out caching and optimizations and adjust what is most likely to be queried, then you can really improve the performance of your server. Again, there's other trade-offs and et cetera, right? But like
you use Apollo on the server side as well.
Yeah, we use Apollo server as our API server client. Yeah.
You don't have to, but
you don't have to. I mean, I'm sure there's other GraphQL server GraphQL clients that I've never used any, but
what were you saying?
But it's a JavaScript implementation. So if you're not doing JavaScript on the server,
yeah. So we use Nest as our server, and then we use Apollo. Like Nest has a first-party Apollo and GraphQL implementation, which just uses Apollo server internally. Right, just delegates to Apollo server.
I think we didn't use Apollo on this. We only used Apollo client, so you can.
Yeah, and that was one of the first things that pissed me off when I used Apollo client in an Angular app, but we were having Java on the backend side, no Apollo server there. So one of the big things that you read very quickly and this was 2017, so things might have changed by now. But one of the big things at that time was like, well, GraphQL supports streaming out of the box of data, which is nice, but that is a benefit of Apollo.js, not of GraphQL. So when you're not using Apollo on the server, streaming says bye-bye. No streaming for you.
Yeah, so GraphQL is the underlying technology and specification. Apollo is an implementation of it. So they've, of course, layered their own improvements, features, tooling,
like
all that on top.
optimistic responses, like all
Exactly.
that. Like it handles a lot for you. And then, and you can really effectively, like, instead of trying, so our NGRX global store implementation was effectively trying to replicate the caching that Apollo client does.
Yeah, and we did the same thing. We're like, this is wildly complicated to like merge all this data in memory after making the API calls so that we could build out these highly dynamic UIs.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we went with GraphQL, because now
and Apollo does it. It just does it. Well, as long as you name
it up correctly,
the right things and set it up right.
You need to architect it, and that's the problem with a lot of softwares out there.
What? Why do we need architecture, Jay? This sounds like kind of oppressive.
Just write the code. Just write the code. Just build the product and you're good.
Jay, I'm not even going to write the code. I'm just going to have Copilot do it.
Vibe code. Just vibe code it.
I'm going to vibe code it out.
Can't wait.
Nothing will go wrong. All right. I think. Oh, and then you can do batching on the client side, right?
You can do what, sorry?
Batching. Yeah, we talked about batching, you and I.
Yeah. So you effectively tell Apollo Angular, like, okay, batch these requests in a 100 millisecond tick. So if a page load happens and like 5 components render in parallel, right? And they all send their own GraphQL request, then Apollo Angular will, instead of sending an operation as an object in the body, it'll send an array of objects in the body. And then the Apollo server will say like, oh, this is an array of operations, not just a single operation. Okay, I'm going to process them sequentially.
That's cool.
Okay. All right. Jan, you were going to say something.
Yes, I have one last question for you, Jay.
Okay.
So no super serious mode, okay?
Serious mode. No one can see how serious we are. We're so serious.
So serious.
I'm getting nervous.
How long? That's actually not the question. How long are you now using GraphQL in your code base at Trellis?
How long?
Yeah.
2 years, 3 years.
Okay. So with what you know now, would you change anything about your implementation? Like assuming like this is the Wild West and you have like unlimited resources. I mean, you're a startup. You basically have unlimited resources.
Unlimited.
Right? This is how this works.
Yeah.
So
that's what the CEO thinks. Not. Sorry, Justin, if you're listening to this.
He wasn't. I mean, he was talking about this other company that was like Schmeller.
A side gig. No, jokes aside, like if you, with what you know now, 2 years later, would you do things differently? What would you change? Would you spend some time optimizing some things if you would have the time?
I would, I'd be a little bit more strict in determining how we want our responses to be structured. Because like GraphQL doesn't just define the response type for you. You define the input type, you define the arguments, the query params effectively. You define the response type, right? So you want to design the system such that the response types can be extended on and flexible, right? So instead of, for example, instead of just returning the customer object as the response type, maybe you return the customer object as a key of the response type so that you can extend on that without having to change that structure later. Because like maybe you want to return some additional data alongside the customer that would then get updated in the cache. You can't do that now without changing that whole response type to maybe having a customer key with the customer object, but the clients are still going to be expecting just a full customer object. So like really spending, and this is also a problem with REST APIs, right? You need to be thoughtful with how you define your request and response, because then you have to version your APIs or you have to push break and change and whatever, right? Which isn't a problem for some custom companies, but it is for most. So I would spend some time considering how we want our response types to be structured. Now, I think that may have been a small learning on our part, because we didn't fully realize what we could do with response types. Like in GraphQL, everything is tracked via like its object type and ID, right? So customer, order, coupon, whatever, right? So if, say, Apollo GraphQL gets an object back, it knows that object is a customer, and it knows that customer's ID is this, right? So it's always able to update the cache and stuff like that, right? So if you're mutating a customer, you don't just have to return the customer. You can return whatever object types you want from that mutation, and then Apollo will update all of the object types that it finds in that response, right? So it doesn't need to be only return this. Like maybe your mutation changed the payment method object type on that customer because it's part of the customer mutation, right? You can return an object that is customer this, payment method this, and then the Apollo will update both of them, right? Where so like we have like a bit of a mix of the two, right? Because we haven't gone back to change things, where some responses are just the entity, and then some are a more extensible format where we can add optional keys in the future to improve our responses or to do something else or whatever, right? So that's definitely one of the things that I would have changed.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I think that is one of the difficult parts because we're so in this like REST way of thinking.
It's not a one-to-one with REST. It's absolutely not a one-to-one. Like, do not try and think it's a one-to-one. You need to understand the differences and what it's doing differently than REST to use it effectively.
Is there like a GraphQL for dummies kind of thing? Like the best, or like from your aspect, the best way to get into GraphQL?
I mean, at this point, I would just use ChatGPT and just ask it, like, give me a getting started guide. You know,
it's around long enough. Yeah.
And there's like graphql.org/learn.
Like I mean, the Apollo docs are great. Like the Apollo server docs, honestly, they're great. And if you're using some server-side stuff, like if you're using Nest, for example, right? There's a first-party Apollo plugin for Nest built by the Nest team. It's in their documentation. Super easy to get started. They go through schema first, and they go through code first. They go through both, and then they talk about resolvers and mutations and authentication and guards and all that kind of stuff, right? So find whatever framework you're using and see if that framework has an implementation for GraphQL or Apollo.
Cool. Yeah, and then CodeGen too. There's different. They support a ton of different things. Like if your backend is using like Yoga, they have generators for that. They have, TypeScript generators and, Apollo specific generators. So, and there's like just like a whole, what did they call it? It's like there's like a GraphQL consortium or something. Like there's like literally like a board, like kind of like TypeScript, but not TypeScript, where they approve tooling for things and like support tooling for things. Like I can't remember.
Is it like a foundation?
What's that?
Like a foundation kind of thing?
Yeah.
Like .NET? Or...
Yeah. Like where things, like if things start to be unsupported and they're important to the community, they adopt them, that kind of stuff.
That's cool.
But I can't remember what it's called, so I'm very helpful.
Super helpful.
Conceptually, it's still cool.
Yeah, I can't remember what it's called. I feel like such an idiot. Well, let me just Google GraphQL consortium. That sounds like the right GraphQL. No, wait, that's Federation. Federation is different.
Federation is different.
Oh no, wait. Okay, hold on. Okay.
Are you talking about the guild?
That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
Yeah, GraphQL Guild.
Yeah.
Okay, well, but that's a company. That is run by...
They adopt things that fall off though. Like they adopted one of the I want to say maybe it was GraphQL request or something. There was some library that they recently adopted. And this is all just me doing random Googling, but
the guy that ran it used to be a Angular GDE. I have his, what's his name? He has like really crazy hair in a good way.
I'm gonna find his picture. No, it's not in there. They're not in and about, but but it is called Guild. Thank you. That's like consortium. It's kind of the thing, like, but there's some resources through there too.
Yuri Goldstein. That's
Ah,
he's
okay.
running the company, and he used to be an Angular GDE, like way back, Angular 2 beta phase kind of thing.
Okay. Like a million years, like old school. But anyways, yeah, there's because I think they support. Did they own CodeGen? Maybe that's where I came up. I don't know. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to keep talking, so I'll just sound like a dum-dum. But there are resources out there. There's also a ton of courses. Like LinkedIn has courses. Like,
Oh yeah.
So
there's so much out there.
Yeah. And I don't know, like, in your opinion, Jay, I don't feel like there's been a lot of changes.
Not to my knowledge.
Like, it feels like
It's
everything
pretty
else has
stable.
changed, like, super, especially in Angular. We've seen so much happening so fast. I don't feel like GraphQL has suffered from that same, like, I'm sure there's things that people will be like, but what about this? And I'll be like, I didn't know about that because I haven't done it for 4 years. But
yeah.
But just it's also a little bit different to like change a schema, right? Like a specification.
Yeah.
Like if you compare it with like JPA Hibernate, that also hasn't changed in like
right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just saying, like, don't worry, y'all. If you learned something 4 years ago, it's probably still applicable.
Unless you're doing
absolutely
Gatsby. Don't do Gatsby.
Don't do Gatsby.
Yeah, don't do that. No, yeah, exactly.
But yeah, we're like, I should probably go back to my real job at some point today. But
This is not your real job.
it's not. Nobody pays me for this. That's why I can say
You're not paid.
You should use NX and definitely go to ng-conf, like, because I'm not getting paid to do that. So
we're just unpaid shills.
We're unpaid shills. I'm just here because I like to tell people what to do. So
Amazing.
One more outlet for me to control people.
This is just a way for me to talk more.
Exactly, about nerdy stuff without my spouse being like, yeah, okay, that sounds reasonable. What? You know, it's bad though when like they know the name of every person you work with because you've clearly been ranting about stuff too much. So yeah, anyways, Jay, we appreciate you being here today. I feel like if you don't know how to reach out to Jay Bell, you aren't trying hard enough. But Jay, where's the best place to reach out to you?
What's the best place? Probably on Bluesky now. jcooperbell.dev.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it'll be in the show notes if anybody wants it.
Yeah, and definitely if you aren't on Bluesky, I am gonna shill for them because it's literally like I got back that great like Twitter vibe that I had before Twitter turned into a weird neo-Nazi bar. So I enjoy being there. But yeah, Jay, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for everything you do for the community. You're always willing to help people out, and I think that's amazing. We also love having you on the podcast. And due to our, we know that listeners love having you on the podcast as well. So definitely subscribe if you have not. If you have not bought your tickets to ng-conf yet, that is happening in October in Maryland this time. So it is a venue change.
Smash that subscribe button.
Smash it. Just smash it. Like, get out a hammer and smash it. Okay, I need to go because I'm getting like a little bit, my blood sugar's low.
We have our NX Champions meeting in 5 minutes, Laura.
Or did you go to the morning one? I went to the 7:30 one because I'm not reliable. I usually am taping this podcast at the same time. So
yeah, that one's too early for me.
What? No, that doesn't seem
5:30 a.m.
7:30 is a little bit too early for me.
I'm not paid enough for that.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jay. Thank you for your time. To the community, thank you for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks, everyone.